Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. And today we are discussing a heated subject that has gotten to mainstream ways and has mostly been arising from specialized groups that have focused on free trade agreements and understanding what is going on behind the curtains of governments and corporations deciding on these major trades that we have little to no idea on how they would affect our day-to-day living, our products, our services. So this has been a subject of public debate, but to know more about it and to understand exactly what we're talking about when we say TTIP or TPP, and specifically focusing on the role of a corporate Europe Observatory and one of its representatives, Pia Eberhardt. She's going to be discussing with us about this subject. So welcome to the Hangout, Pia, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
So to everyone watching, I'd like to remind you that we will be talking for about 40 minutes. So please make sure that your questions and comments come through the Google event. I know that through mobile, you cannot really place questions. I know it is a problem, but it doesn't matter. Once that the video is uploaded on YouTube, you're always welcome to place the comments there. And so without further ado, let's get into our discussion, Pia. So let's begin with the very basics. There's sometimes a confusion in our minds, and it seems to be on purpose. What is a TTIP?
Where TTIP stands for a Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and it's the biggest trade agreement that has ever been negotiated, and it's currently being negotiated between the EU and the US. They started negotiations 2 years ago. I think that negotiations will continue for many more years to come. It's a super complex agreement that contains all kinds of elements that we know from classical trade deals. So it's about lowering tariffs. So when cars get imported from the EU to the US, tariffs for these cars will be lowered, but it's about much more than that. It's about, what kind of regulations are allowed in regulating banks. It's about food safety standards that are very different on both sides of the Atlantic. And most importantly, maybe it's a deal that is set out to give a lot of more additional powers to corporations to challenge whatever they dislike on both sides of the Atlantic, whether that is stricter regulations in the, for example, financial market sector, or any kind of other regulation they dislike. So this is why for us it's not so much a trade agreement. That word is maybe a bit deceptive. It's more like corporate empowerment agreement.
That is also part of how a language is used. I mean, I know that this trade was meant to be kept secret, but of course it has reached the mainstream, and it seems that even with the name, it is implying something that sounds very nice and very regulated, but is it in fact so?
No, it's, as I said, it's very much, it's a corporate empowerment agreement that will give corporations, I mean, they already have a lot of power over politics, as we know, but they will just get more power to more tools and instruments that they can use in the political process to challenge whatever they dislike, whatever hampers their corporate profits. And so to weaken regulation, to postpone, to maybe prevent that, for example, strict measures to fight climate change will ever see the day of light. So yeah, it's this 4 words TPP, TTIP or trade agreement are really do mask a bit of the actual context. Interestingly enough, in the US context, US campaigning groups still do not call it the TTIP, but they call it TAFTA. That was its very early name. when the EU and the US started, discussing shouldn't we negotiate such a transatlantic trade agreement, they started to call it TAFTA. And in the US, groups continue to call it that way because it sounds a bit like NAFTA, the free trade agreement that we already have for 20 years between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And when you call it TAFTA in the US or in Mexico or in Canada, people, remember NAFTA, and they very much understand that this is not about a trade agreement that is in their interest, but a trade agreement that will cost jobs and will allow corporate attacks against democratic policies.
It is like the regularization of public theft, in essence. I mean, I live in Mexico, and yes, it's been 20 years ago that the country has become just another pawn for the major corporate powers in America, and we become the cheap labor and the resource provider. And if anyone really wants to see the effect of what these free trade agreements create and the impact it has on an entire nation, you can come to Mexico. I would suggest that to witness that. So I'd like to just ask you to then clarify what TPP is.
Yeah, because I was also already mixing it up. It's all these acronyms. It's very typical for the field of international trade. TPP is just another really big trade agreement that is currently under negotiation, but the US is also involved, but for the rest it's different partners. So it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So you have the whole Trans-Pacific area on board. Negotiations there are more advanced. It's just been a deal that has been under negotiation longer than TTIP. But these trade agreements, they're all closely linked. I would say, the field of trade liberalization or trade negotiations, it's like a motorway with different lanes. They all go into the same direction. They all have the same purpose, and they all, to a certain extent, build on each other, and are like equally dangerous when it comes to things like, access to food, to water, to medicines, privacy on the internet, and in generally like health of our environment and democracy. They're equally dangerous. In the US, the debate is very much about the TPP at the moment, just because I think it's more advanced. It's not so much an issue in Europe, where TTIP has really become a big issue, at least in some countries where it's really where we really have a public debate about TTIP, where people talk about it in bars and in comedy shows, for example.
Yeah, that's a great way to start spreading the awareness on this. But I see that sometimes even this confusion on the American factor of it in the TPP and the TTIP in Europe is sometimes confused. So thanks for that clarification. Let's go on to the secrecy aspect of this, because we know that, for example, the European Commissioner, de Gucht, claimed that there is nothing secret about the ongoing talks, and that later on he said, well, our negotiations over this transatlantic trade and investment partnership are fully open to scrutiny. So is this really so? And what is the case then around secrecy on these projects?
No, of course, it's not the case. I mean, negotiations are secret. So when negotiations take place, no one but the European Commission and the US government is in the room. Which is not necessary. You have other international negotiations where that is different, where negotiations, for example, are web screened. That happens. But what is maybe even more important is that the substance of the negotiations is not public. So the draft text of the final agreement is not shared with the public. That text remains secret, and it will remain secret until the very end of the negotiations, until negotiations are closed. And then obviously it's very difficult to make changes to the text. And if you compare that to an ordinary legislative process, this is very different. I mean, in Europe, when we have, the discussion of a European law, this law gets published in all kinds of different draft stages before it's done. So this allows journalists, academics, but also NGOs, the interested public, everyone who is interested, but who might also have a certain amount of expertise on an issue, to understand what's on the table and to bring in their views. And this is exactly not what's happening in trade negotiations, where this information is kept secret from the people. So it's exactly impossible to fully understand what TTIP or other agreements are all about. And I think the reason why this is so is exactly that if people, have a chance to see what's being negotiated and are able to make up their minds and to understand what's on the table, they will simply not accept what is supposedly done in their name, and they will revolt. And we have seen that time and again in the history of trade negotiations, that whenever texts have become public and whenever experts, NGOs have been able to show to citizens what could be the dangers of these texts, then they have been rejected, whether that was in the 90s, where there was already an attempt to negotiate a global investment agreement, and that failed because of huge public pressure and because France stepped out of the negotiations. Another example is the attempt to negotiate a free trade area of the whole Americas, which also failed at the beginning of the century due to public opposition. Or you might also have heard of the so-called ACTA agreement, which was an agreement about copyright, many online issues. That also failed because the European Parliament voted it down because of huge public pressure in Europe against this agreement, particularly by young people. So yeah, this shows that when you manage as civil society to pull out into the light what is negotiated behind closed doors, there is a good chance that these agreements will never actually happen.
There is many times this public discouragement that, well, we cannot do much about it, but you've just shared with us that, yes, public opinion matter, and that's why we are also doing this kind of interviews and discussions to bring it to public awareness, and so put our grain of sand on this pressure, public pressure, to prevent this from happening. As a continuation from the previous question, this was brought forth to our awareness by Jean, one of our team members, and she was asking that if that was the case in terms of, our negotiations are open for scrutiny, why then were the notes of commission meetings with business lobbyists released to the corporate Europe Observatory, which is your organization, under the EU's Freedom of Information law, heavily censored?
Yeah, well, thanks for raising this. So we are a lobby watchdog, so we really look at how do companies influence EU politics in many areas, including EU trade negotiations. And to do that kind of research, we work a lot with the EU's access to information law, which is actually at the moment still pretty good and allows everyone, not just EU citizens, everyone to ask for all kinds of information. And we use it to ask for, lists of meetings that the European Commission had with business lobbyists, minutes relating to these meetings, and correspondence. And yeah, I would say we do get useful information. At least you can see who knocks on the European Commission's doors, who knocks most often, who meets. But then again, we very often don't get the full information because the EU's access to information law does foresee a couple of exceptions, for example, the protection of international relations, and the European Commission uses these exceptions excessively, I would say, to censor the kinds of documents that would, give a bit of an indication of what's on the table. So yeah, this is where the censorship comes from, and we challenge that. We've challenged that again and again, including at the European Court of Justice, where unfortunately we have recently lost a case linked to such kind of information battles. They were not related to the EU-US trade talks, but to the EU-India trade negotiations. And it was documents where we could show, well, you gave them to large business lobby groups without censorship. even asked them, to share this kind of information with business colleagues in India. And why on earth did you withhold the same information when a public interest group like us asked for it? We thought it's a very strong case, but unfortunately, the European Court of Justice sided with the European Commission.
And what can we do when we face these kind of barriers when it comes to transparency? I mean, what can we as citizens of the world, not only people in Europe, what can we do to further some kind of legislation that can enhance transparency and so that the public can gain direct access to this information and so place direct insight into these negotiations?
Well, I mean, strengthening access to information rules for sure is one way, and they have improved in many countries of the world. So they simply give more rights to citizens to ask information from their governments. But I guess it's also about just making this a scandal. It's completely unacceptable in any democratic society that a trade agreement that will, just bind societies forever, because de facto it's just impossible to get out of a trade agreement, to negotiate such kind of agreements behind closed doors. So as citizens, I think it's about speaking out in public and social media, speaking out to the media, pressuring your media also, also the corporate media into, looking into these agreements, telling them that you as citizens, you want to learn about what's going on. It's about pressuring elected governments to speak out, to want to see the text. Like in Europe, we have a very interesting movement at the moment of city governments, of local governments who will be affected by TTIP. Because of the power they have, for example, over organizing public services, water, electricity, these kind of things. This is where cities still have a lot to say. And if now these sectors, get liberalized and opened up under TTP, they should be involved. They should know. So we have many city governments at the moment saying, we want to see the text. We want to see what you negotiate on our behalf. And even city governments coming up with resolutions where they say they reject these kind of trade agreements. And this is a result of public pressure of people on the local level, then hammering on their local governments to speak out. So I would say, even though it's really difficult to change something, it is not so difficult to create awareness and a mass and public debate about these trade agreements, even though they seem so horribly complicated and far away from people's lives.
That is a common concern, I agree. And you were mentioning that people in Europe, I mean, in specific countries, are concerned about different aspects of how the TTIP would affect them. Can you give us some examples of this?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how the resistance in different EU countries caters for different things that people care about. For example, if you look at the UK, where you do have a strong anti-TTIP movement, the number one issue for activists there is the threat that this agreement proposes to the National Health Service in the UK, the NHS, which has already been under attack, from the government. It's trying to basically roll back health protection. But people just fear that there will be another attack under the umbrella of TTIP. And so there, the NHS is the number one issue. In France, I would say it's different. It's agriculture is very important, because it's obvious that, agriculture is part of the TTIP negotiations, and the agricultural systems are very different on both sides of the Atlantic. In general, you can say that production costs are lower in the US. Costs for land, for example, is lower in the US. And this is why you, to a much larger extent, you have these big mega farms, so-called factory farming in the US. We have that too in Europe, but to a smaller extent. And farmers in Europe really fear that they will basically be wiped out when, protections that still exist in the form of tariffs in the agriculture sector will be wiped out through TTIP. And this is an issue that is, for example, very strong in France. The same is for food safety standards. They are, again, very different on both sides of the Atlantic. When you look at something like how much pesticide traces are allowed in food, very often limitations are higher in Europe. So we have less pesticide residues in food than are allowed in the US. And so people fear that this will change, that standards will be lowered. And I would say this is something that moves people in many parts of Europe. So it's all kinds of different issues. And I think one cross-cutting issue that mobilizes many people in many different EU countries and all sectors of organized civil society, whether it's trade unions or public health groups or consumer advocates, is the additional rights that corporations would get under this agreement to challenge regulation under the so-called investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. And it's an issue that outrages people in, I would say, all parts of the world whenever these far-reaching corporate rights are included in an agreement. Then people just, first they cannot believe it, and then they are simply outraged and really fight this massive corporate power grab.
This is part of the questions that we got even before the Hangout started, and it is by a user. And he's saying, how did we reach a point within Western democracies where such agreements are presented as done deals, where democracy is bypassed and agreements are made in secret?
Well, it's, you have to look into the history of investment agreements. These agreements have been signed since the late 50s and 60s. We have thousands of them in place already today. Most of them, they are bilateral, so they are between two countries. And I would say the historical background was very much post-colonialism. So you have the 50s and the 60s, where many of the countries in the global south become independent. And the former colonial powers just want to protect their businesses in these countries from things like expropriation, nationalization. Many of these countries were trying to regain control, for example, over their natural resources, didn't want to keep them in the hands of the colonial powers. So that was the historical context. So it's very much a Western, let's say, neo-colonial instrument to protect Western companies. And the thousands of agreements we have are still very much north-south or between southern countries. And it's only in the recent years that this system is enshrined in trade agreements between Western powers, between capital exporting powers. And it's only with this now, you might call it hypocritical, which is a fair point, that people in these Western societies realize, well, wait a minute, why should we in Western Europe, for example, give US companies so much power, over our societies? Aren't our laws not good enough for them? Aren't our courts not good enough for them? So this is why this system, which has been rotten and wrong from the very beginning, is now becoming also increasingly controversial in the countries that created it to protect their businesses.
It is corporate imperialism, in fact. So, in terms of looking at how we could prevent this like omni-power that corporations can get through these trade agreements or legal imperialism, I'm looking at the point of nationalization of resources, which is something that we propose in the living income proposal, how each country, through nationalizing their resources, not only do they claim property over them for the citizens of that nation, but also that the profit made of the use and production and exportation and so forth from these resources could be given back to the people in a form of a basic income, for example. What's your perspective on these sort of possible solutions?
Yeah, I would definitely support them, not from a, from a perspective of sovereignty, but also it's a question of control, of societies. And I think definitely natural resources should be controlled by those, who who've owned them for many decades. The same as land, land should be controlled by those who work it, and not by big agricultural businesses. But it's about more than a question of sovereignty. When you look at, for example, the challenge we are all facing of climate change, I mean, there is undisputed consensus in the climate science that we need to leave, for example, the oil in the ground. We need to leave fossil fuels in the ground if we want our planet basically to survive with us on it. What that means is at one point you will have to force the big energy companies to leave the oil in the ground, because believe it or not, they already own the oil. It's not in our hands. It's in corporate hands. So if you force them to not use and make profit from the oil, this is nothing but expropriation, and we need to be able as societies to do that without paying ourselves crazy because of investment agreements, which then give these oil companies a lot of power to challenge such kind of measures. So yeah, I think that's a good example about how sovereignty is also linked to issues of survival. And it's really needed to reclaim democratic control, whether that is over natural resources or many other things, where actually corporations dominate our lives. In Europe, for example, we have an interesting, or I think in many areas of the world, we have an interesting local food movement, but also an interesting local energy movement where people realize, well, it's actually not been so beneficial, to hand these parts of our lives over to corporations. We need to organize things in a bit more clever way and closer to us so that we are actually in control. And trade agreements go exactly into the opposite direction.
So along with this, we have a question from Joanna Jesus, and she's saying, "Hi, Pia, thanks for sharing this info. In your perspective, what is the alternative to TTIP, or how could TTIP or any future trade agreement be designed in order to be in the citizens' interests?" Thank you.
Well, it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, we in Europe, we engaged in a process for a couple of years that was called the Alternative Trade Mandate process. So we, as civil society, trade unions, environmentalists, democracy groups, we tried to write our own mandate for EU trade policy. And as you can imagine, that's not so easy. Trade unions, for example, have a very different view about trade policy and exports, as, for example, environmentalists, which might be much more in favor for a concept like delocalization, bringing more stuff to where it's actually, to the local level or the regional level, and not exporting for the sake of exports. But workers in the export sectors might have a different view. So it was not an easy process. And in the end, we ended up with, I would say, more a catalog of principles, where principles like deglobalization, more regionalisms found their way into the paradigm. But we didn't succeed in really writing an alternative trade agreement. But I think it's the principles we have to start from. And one principle that I always find very compelling has been developed in the food sector, particularly. It's called food sovereignty. You might know it. It's been developed by farmers' movements around the world, from the north and the south, and small-scale farmers that said, well, land should be controlled by those who work it. The seeds should be owned by those who grow it. Food should be produced very much more with a local and regional focus, which doesn't mean that there shouldn't be trade in agricultural products. Of course, there should be trade for certain products that just cannot be grown in a region. But the focus should be very much the local and regional markets, in as far as that is possible. and the focus for food production should also be, to feed the people and not just to trade it around the globe like crazy. That is for the food sector. For other sectors, knowledge, there have been concepts, that focus more on sharing knowledge rather than patenting it and therefore making it exclusive, to some. So I think it's more, I'm not sure. It's probably not the perfect answer, but it's these kinds of principles that should guide an alternative trade policy. And of course, that should be developed in a much more democratic and therefore people-centered way than that is currently the case.
I would say that is also would have to come from people organizing in the different sectors, as you were mentioning, agriculture, and then there's the same with education and those that are dedicated to freedom of information, so that maybe these groups could present these principles and so gather them all together to kind of create a comprehensive work that could be a counteract to the TTIP. That's something that occurs to me, and that then it can be placed for democratic exercise. That would be something that could happen. That is what comes up to mind at the moment. We have another question, basically about GMOs. So we have this from Andrea Thiel. She's saying, in agriculture, what about GMOs since they are banned in Europe and prolific in the US? Is this a big issue for Europeans?
It's a huge issue for Europeans. In many EU countries, we have strong movements against GMO, including people, who destroy fields where you have GMO trials. It is also clear that it's an important issue in TTIP. I mean, the US agribusiness sector has been very clearly saying, that they're not happy with the GMO law in Europe and that they see TTIP as a chance to change that. You also have professional lobby firms that have said, hello, dear US agribusiness, TTIP is your once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to break through, the GMO barriers. And we also have US policymakers that have said, we will never say yes to a TTIP that doesn't significantly increase the market access for US agribusiness. At the same time, we have European policymakers who say, well, don't worry, TTIP will not change anything about GMOs in Europe. We will see what comes out in the end. The pressure is clearly there. And the door to GMOs might be opened through, innocently sounding principles like the principle of sound science. So we can see the GMO lobby basically saying, okay, we want a TTIP agreement that says that policy making in the EU should be guided by sound science. You might wonder, well, what's the problem with sound science? Of course, no, I mean, who should be against sound science? But what this means basically is that whenever you don't have a 100% scientific consensus on an issue, is GMO dangerous or not? What kind of effects will they have on the human body or the environment? It will be very difficult to ban products. And this is exactly a key difference that we have behind policymaking in the EU and the US. In the EU, we have a space for what is called the precautionary principle, which is not always implemented, but it has a part in EU politics. And it basically says that you can ban a product even when you're not so sure whether it's risky or not, when there are certain doubts. So there's no 100% proof that it's dangerous, but there are doubts, or maybe even ethical concerns. People just don't want it. That's enough to say no. That's very different in the US. In the US, you ban a product when the disaster is there, when it's clear and you can see it, that there is a problem, and then you start regulating. And TTIP is very much about, an attack on the precautionary principle in the EU, which is hidden in things like, the US agribusiness lobby push for enshrining a principle like sound science in the agreement. So yes, it's a very important issue for Europe and the debate we have on TTIP.
And on this, also the user keymaker asked, is this not pointing, meaning the passing of this kind of trade agreements, is this not pointing to a complete failure of the participating governing bodies to their democratic requirements? And is this a failure, a crime, a large-scale crime that is not being commented as such? And what does it mean to us, the people being governed by these institutions and entities that, as it's been said, and if you can expand on that, that corporations will be able to sue governments, for example?
Yeah, well, I would say trade and negotiations, when they're happening behind closed doors and also the direction they're taking, they're a huge, excuse me the word, a huge fuck scandal. What is important to know is that they're not necessarily supported by all parts of government. They are negotiated by trade negotiators, people, I would say, that are bureaucrats. They're usually not elected, so not accountable to any kind of public pressure. They believe in the good of free trade, so are also ideologically, I would say, pretty much blinded. They see themselves as servants of big business. I mean, the European Commission's Trade Department very clearly says our job is to go out into the world and open markets for EU companies, whatever the cost. But you have other parts in government that do not necessarily see their purpose that way, that care about the environment. And this is what we're actually seeing in Europe, and we have seen that in other parts of the world. When other parts of government begin to understand about a trade agreement, they start getting concerned, and they also start raising their voice, and also challenging the other parts of government. And this is exactly the moment where public pressure and public campaigning comes in, also to waken up, other parts of government or in parliaments. I mean, people sign off these trade agreements literally without really understanding them. So it's also our part to make it very difficult for them to get away with that. So yeah, this is really where public pressure comes in. And as you asked also about these, the rights for foreign investors to sue governments, you can exactly see these problems there. Governments, including parliaments, sign off these trade agreements and have signed thousands of them. And I would argue, without really knowing what they're doing, they understand what they did when the claim hits, when their country gets sued. This is when suddenly you have public outcry, people start raising their eyebrows and wonder, like, what did we sign up to? This is, for example, what happened in South Africa, a very interesting case where the government signed many treaties, and then suddenly it was sued because of the Black Empowerment Act in South Africa, so an anti-discrimination law. And Western investors, European investors, challenged that law, saying, well, you basically didn't treat us in a fair and equitable way. You expropriated us, so this is why we sue you. And it's only because of that claim, sadly enough, that the public and the government in South Africa understood, like, ooh, this is not what we meant when we wanted to attract investors. And this led to a long public debate and to a complete reversal of South Africa's policy in that area, because at the moment, South Africa is terminating investment treaties that it signed in the 90s because it realized, wow, they're very dangerous. And actually, they also didn't even bring any kind of investment.
I can attest to that, having lived in South Africa for 1 year, and definitely the economy was not good at all. So there was another proof of living in a third world country that hasn't had any benefit of these kind of free trade agreements. As a comment and also a question on what you also described just now, from World in Reverse, he's saying the corporations have bribed the political leaders in every country to sign away their sovereignty and the general welfare of their people to private corporations. Is this a major method, in your opinion, used to undermine democracy worldwide?
Yeah, I would say that is the whole point of this global investment regime, of the thousands of treaties. I mean, these treaties are a way for corporations to really get big bucks. When a government regulates, they sue the governments, and they might go home with 2, 3, 4, however billion US dollars in compensation. So it is a money-making machine for them. But I would say the main function really is that it works like a legal straitjacket for politics. It just makes it really difficult to regulate, and it gives corporations a powerful weapon that they can always pull. When you have a political debate about, let's say, financial market regulation, the banks can always threaten to sue. And I would say that every policymaker that is not completely out of their minds is well advised to take that threat seriously, because at the end of this legal attack, there could be a multi-billion award that the government and thereby the taxpayers have to pay. So it is really about intimidating governments, about regulation, making regulation more difficult, about making it more difficult to change relationships, including private property relationships, and so making change, progressive change that we are campaigning for, more difficult, and shielding corporations against the threats, of democracy. So yes, I would say that's definitely the main function of the system.
Okay, and we got from Andrea Thiel, based on the principles that you were mentioning before, she's asking, is there a publication of the principles that you talk about that North Americans can access?
Well, yes, you find, so everything we publish as Corporate Europe Observatory is online and in English. And you find that on our website. It's called corporateeurope.org. And if you go to the international trade section, you find a lot about the proposed investor rights in TTIP, also other areas, including the kind of principles that are under negotiation in the agriculture sector. And while I'm talking, I'll just see if I can find the exact publication that is relevant for the food and farming sector that might be of interest to you.
Yeah, we can leave a link to it as well in the info section of this Hangout, so that, Andrea, you can access it as well, because I see that as also a way to unify the same principles, whether you're in America or Europe. It doesn't matter, because we are just human beings and we all have to stand for the basic access to our living rights, and that implies also, in terms of food, our basic services, and having the foundation on how to start actively talking about how to reclaim them, or rather specify that those cannot be altered by corporations in this case. So I'd like to ask you, in terms of the solution aspect to this problem, many times there is like a very vicious attack on corporations only, and seeing only them as the problem. But you and your organization have an interesting approach to it. So how do you see that solutions can emerge?
Well, we do indeed. I would say we do see corporations as a big part of the problem, and corporate lobbying in particular, and how corporations really manage again and again to weaken, delay, or even prevent legislation that would protect us, the people, and the environment. So they are definitely part of the problem. They have to be regulated, that their power just has to be limited, and that is not going to be easy because obviously their interest is a different one. But at CO, we not only look at corporations, we also look at the state, at governments, which are very often complicit, in corporate crimes and corporate wrongdoings. So it's, I would say, two sides of the same coin. And the solutions, I guess, are about awareness raising. They are about resistance, against new and upcoming corporate attacks such as TTIP. But I think they also have to come from below, about people creating space that is free from corporate control. And I have mentioned the very inspiring movement I find about energy sovereignty that is quite big in Europe, where people very much on the local level, where energy providers have been privatized in the 90s, and the municipalities basically sold off their energy facilities, and people are now reversing that trend, particularly through decentralized renewable energy and cooperatives. And we have a similar movement in the food sector. And I think this is really, for me, these are the seeds, for an alternative where there are new spaces emerge, where it's no longer the Walmarts or the Suez and the BPs that have the control, but it's much more the people. And even though these are, let's say, small-scale initiatives, I think this is where where the alternatives have to come from. But at the same time, we have to be aware, that it's just not enough to create these spaces, but we also have to secure them on the long run. And this is then again where the fight against TTIP and other trade agreements plays a role, because these trade agreements will just make it more difficult in the long run to create these spaces and secure them and expand them.
I would say that also the solution will always lie at a systematic level, meaning changing and actively ensuring that the regulation is there so that no corporation can trespass these laws that can be democratically instituted in the constitution of countries, for example. So from our perspective, we do see that awareness, very necessary, of course, but at the same time, the systematic approach and yes, maybe focusing locally on what we can do, but also looking at the greater picture, which will also be part of the conversation that we will be having next week. So stay tuned for that as well for our viewers. So Pia, I'd like you to give us some last comments on your organization if someone wants to research more information or wants to be part of it, if it is possible, and any last points that you'd like to share to end this hangout.
Yeah, maybe just to add that I fully agree with what you just said. I mean, we have to force corporations to do what we want them to do. They won't do it automatically. This is not how capitalism works. So they have to be forced by regulations to pay taxes, to pay decent wages, to produce products that are good and safe. And they have to be stopped, from lobbying against all these kinds of regulations. So I just wanted to add that. And about my organization, Corporate Europe Observatory, as I said, you can check out online what we're doing. We have a narrow focus in the work we do. As I say, we do research and campaigning on how corporations influence EU politics in all kinds of areas. So we do a lot of research, but we do that not for the sake of researching it, but also to really roll back and fight back corporate power over EU politics, because we see they have way too much say over the kind of policies that are being decided on in the EU. And it's not what we need, to confront the challenges we are facing, whether that is social inequality or climate change. So yeah, I just hope that you find our work interesting. We are not we're an NGO. We have staff members. We're not a membership organization. So it's unfortunately not so easy to work with us. We do work with freelancers every now and then. But very often we don't have the resources to pay them adequately. So I guess the easiest way is, if you like our work, to just share it on social media and in your circles and spread the word. And yeah, fight for what we are fighting for in your own context, whether that is against trade agreement or for more, responsibilities for corporations. Yeah, so just thanks for listening, maybe.
Yeah, and thank you and for the work that you and your organization do and for all the details that you've shared with us. I'm sure that many people will find this information useful. So if you like what you saw, please share this information, because this is the purpose of doing this kind of hangouts, a discussion where we get a little bit more enlightened about these topics that sometimes can be too convoluted or shrouded in secrecy. So thanks a lot, Pia, for being here and for your time. And thanks to you, the viewer, as well. Just a last comment is just in from Andrea Tio. She's saying, thank you so much for being on this hangout and being informative from your Euro perspective. And hopefully we can create a bridge with all the people in the world.
I hope so too. Thanks.
And I fully agree with that, Andrea. Thanks for your participation. And thanks to you, the viewer. See you next week. Bye, Pia.
Bye-bye.